There's a photograph hanging in the Montgomery County Historical Museum that no one talks about anymore. Not because it's forgotten, but because those who remember it refuse to speak its name. The image shows 23 children standing in front of Blackwood Elementary School on a crisp October morning in 1911. 23 children posed for that picture. But by Christmas of that same year, only 22 remained. The thing is, if you look closely at the photograph today, you can still see all 23 faces staring back at you, and one of them is smiling wider than the others. Sarah Chen first saw the photograph during a late shift at the museum. She'd been hired as the new night archivist 3 weeks earlier, tasked with cataloging the building's forgotten collection of local history. The pay was decent, and the work suited her preference for solitude. Most nights, she worked alone in the basement archives, surrounded by boxes of century-old documents and photographs that smelled of dust and time. The class picture wasn't supposed to be in her assigned section. She found it tucked behind a water-stained portrait of Montgomery's founding mayor, wrapped in brown paper that crumbled at her touch. No label, no catalog number, just the photograph mounted on deteriorating cardboard with a single word written on the back in faded pencil: "Don't." The image itself seemed ordinary at first glance, standard school photography from the era. The children wore their Sunday best, faces scrubbed clean, hair slicked down with pomade or tied back with ribbons. A stern-looking teacher stood at the left edge of the frame, her hand resting on the shoulder of a small boy in the front row. The school building loomed behind them, its windows like dark eyes watching the scene unfold. Sarah set the photograph on her work table under the harsh fluorescent light. She picked up her camera to document the find, as protocol required. Through the viewfinder, something caught her attention. One of the children in the back row, a girl with dark braids and a white dress, appeared slightly out of focus. Not blurred exactly, but less solid than the others. Like she'd moved during the exposure, except her face was perfectly sharp. Only her edges seemed to fade into the background. She lowered the camera and looked at the photograph directly. The girl appeared normal, solid, clear as every other child in the picture. Sarah raised the camera again. Through the lens, the girl's form wavered once more. She took the photograph anyway, added it to her catalog spreadsheet, and moved on to the next item in the box. But her eyes kept drifting back to the image. Something about it felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. The children's expressions, perhaps. Most looked solemn, as was customary for photographs of that era. Long exposure times required subjects to remain still, giving everyone that trademark serious look. But a few of the children wore faint smiles, and that girl in the back row, the one who seemed to shimmer through the camera lens, her smile was the widest of all. The next morning, Sarah stopped by the museum director's office before heading home. Margaret Winters had run the Montgomery County Historical Museum for 30 years. She knew every item in the collection, every story behind every artifact. If anyone could explain the unmarked photograph, it would be her. Margaret was arranging a display of vintage farming equipment when Sarah knocked on the open door. The older woman looked up, smiled, and gestured her inside. "Find something interesting in the archives?" Margaret asked. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed her the digital image she'd taken. Class picture from 1911, Blackwood Elementary. It wasn't cataloged, and someone wrote, "Don't," on the back. "Do you know anything about it?" The color drained from Margaret's face so quickly that Sarah thought she might faint. The museum director sat down heavily in her chair, eyes fixed on the phone screen. "Where did you find this?" "Behind the mayor's portrait in box 47. Why? What's wrong?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "That photograph was supposed to be destroyed. My predecessor tried to burn it 3 times. It always came back." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of the office. "I don't understand." The girl in the back row, white dress, dark braids. "Do you see her?" Sarah zoomed in on the image. "Yes. Her name was Emily Thorne. She died 2 weeks after this picture was taken. fell down the school's main staircase and broke her neck. The coroner said it was an accident, but there were rumors. Other children claimed she'd been pushed. No one ever proved anything. That's tragic, but why would someone want to destroy the photograph? Margaret met her eyes. Because Emily doesn't stay in the picture. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah wanted to laugh, to dismiss it as local superstition or the ramblings of someone who'd spent too long among dusty artifacts. But Margaret's expression was deadly serious. I know how that sounds, Margaret continued. But there's a reason we don't display that image. There's a reason it was hidden away. People who spend too much time looking at it start to see things. Claim that Emily moves between the other children, that her smile gets wider, that she's looking directly at them, even though the photograph was taken from a fixed position. That's impossible. I agree. It should be impossible. Put it back where you found it, Sarah. Better yet, put it in the incinerator. Some things aren't meant to be preserved. But Sarah didn't destroy the photograph. She told herself she was being scientific, rational. There had to be an explanation for the optical illusion she'd witnessed through her camera. A trick of light and shadow, perhaps. Or a flaw in the original film plate that created the strange effect. She was an archivist, trained to preserve history, not destroy it based on ghost stories. That night, she brought the photograph to her work table again. She examined it under different lights, from different angles. She scanned it at high resolution and studied every pixel on her computer screen. The more she looked, the more convinced she became that something was genuinely wrong with the image. Emily Thorne's position changed. It was subtle. So subtle that Sarah questioned her own memory. But she'd stared at this photograph for hours now. She knew where each child stood. And Emily, who'd been standing behind a tall boy with red hair in her first viewing, now stood one position to the left. Sarah pulled up the digital photo she'd taken the previous night, compared it to the physical photograph in front of her. In the digital version, Emily stood behind the red-headed boy. In the physical photograph, she'd moved. The room suddenly felt colder. Sarah's hands trembled as she set down the magnifying glass. This wasn't possible. Photographs didn't change. Images captured on film plates in 1911 remained fixed, permanent. That was the entire point of photography. She needed to think rationally. Perhaps there were two versions of this photograph. Perhaps she'd accidentally cataloged a different print last night. That had to be it. A simple mix-up, nothing supernatural. Except she knew there was only one photograph. She'd found it alone, unwrapped it herself, documented it. There was no second version. If you're enjoying this mystery, consider subscribing. We explore the darkest corners of history and the unexplained events that still haunt us today. You won't want to miss what happens next. Sarah decided to research Emily Thorne. If this was some elaborate hoax or optical illusion, understanding the real history might provide clues. The museum's library contained Montgomery County newspapers dating back to the 1800s, now preserved on microfilm. She spent her lunch break scrolling through editions from October and November 1911. She found the accident report in the November 3rd edition. "Local girl dies in school tragedy," read the headline. The article was brief, just 3 paragraphs. Emily Thorne, age 9, had fallen down the main staircase at Blackwood Elementary during lunch recess. She'd struck her head and died before the doctor arrived. The school's headmaster expressed his condolences to the family and assured parents that safety measures would be reviewed. But Sarah found something else. A follow-up article from 2 weeks later, buried on page 7. "Questions surround school death," it proclaimed. Apparently, 3 students had come forward claiming they'd seen Emily arguing with another girl at the top of the stairs. They'd heard shouting, then a scream. By the time they reached the staircase, Emily lay at the bottom, neck twisted at an unnatural angle, and the other girl had vanished. The school administration dismissed the claims as childhood imagination. The coroner stood by his ruling of accidental death. The matter was officially closed, but the article noted that Emily's mother had removed her 2 remaining children from Blackwood Elementary and refused to speak to reporters. Sarah found one more reference to the case. An obituary from 1952 for Grace Thorne, Emily's mother. Among the listed survivors was Thomas Thorne, Emily's younger brother, who'd moved to California in 1920. There was an address. It took 3 days of research, but Sarah tracked down Thomas Thorne's descendants. His granddaughter, Rebecca, still lived in Sacramento. Sarah sent her an email, introducing herself as a museum archivist researching Blackwood Elementary's history. She mentioned finding a class photograph that included Emily. Rebecca's response came the next morning. It was longer than Sarah expected. My great-aunt Emily's death destroyed my great-grandmother. She never recovered from losing her daughter. Toward the end of her life, Grace would tell anyone who'd listen that Emily hadn't died from a fall. She'd been murdered by another girl in her class, Margaret Sullivan. According to Grace, Margaret was jealous of Emily's friendship with a boy they both liked. She'd pushed Emily down the stairs, then convinced the other children to stay quiet. My great-grandmother tried for years to prove it, but no one would listen. They said grief had made her irrational. But Grace insisted until her dying day that Margaret Sullivan had murdered her daughter and walked free. The worst part? Margaret Sullivan went on to have a perfectly normal life. She married, had children, became a pillar of the community. She even served on the school board for 15 years. Grace had to watch her daughter's killer be celebrated as a model citizen. Sarah read the email 3 times. Margaret Sullivan. The name meant nothing to her, but she had a class photograph with 23 children in it. One of them had to be the alleged killer. That night, Sarah returned to the archives with a new purpose. She needed to identify every child in that photograph. Somewhere among those 23 faces was the person who might have pushed Emily Thorne to her death. The museum's records included old school registries. After 2 hours of cross-referencing, Sarah had names for 18 of the 23 children. Margaret Sullivan was easy to identify once she knew what to look for. Front row, 3rd from the left. A pretty girl with blonde curls and a bow in her hair. She stood next to the boy who was likely the cause of the rivalry, though Sarah couldn't be certain which one he was. Margaret Sullivan had died in 1989 at age 87. Her obituary painted the picture of a beloved grandmother and community volunteer. There was no mention of Emily Thorne or any childhood tragedy. Whatever happened on those stairs had been buried along with its victim. Sarah looked at the photograph again. Emily stood in the back row, her smile wider than anyone else's, and Margaret Sullivan stood in front, looking slightly to the left, her expression unreadable. Then Sarah noticed something new, something that made her blood run cold. Emily's eyes, which had been looking straight ahead in every previous viewing, now stared down at Margaret Sullivan. Sarah grabbed her phone and pulled up the digital image from days ago. In that version, Emily's gaze was directed at the camera, but in the physical photograph before her, Emily's eyes had moved. They now focused on the blonde girl in the front row with an intensity that seemed to burn through the aged paper. Sarah's rational mind screamed that this was impossible, but the evidence was right in front of her. The photograph was changing. Emily was moving, and she was looking at Margaret Sullivan with what could only be described as hatred. The lights in the archive room flickered. Sarah looked up. The fluorescent tubes buzzed, dimmed, then returned to full brightness. Probably just old wiring in a historic building. Nothing to worry about, except the temperature had dropped. Sarah could see her breath misting in the air. She looked back down at the photograph. Emily had moved again. She now stood directly behind Margaret Sullivan, her smile stretching impossibly wide across her face. Her hands, which had been folded demurely in front of her dress, now hovered just above Margaret's shoulders, as if about to push. "This isn't real," Sarah whispered to the empty room. "Photographs don't move. This isn't real." The lights went out completely. In the absolute darkness of the basement archive, Sarah fumbled for her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. The screen's glow seemed pathetically inadequate against the pressing shadow, but it was better than nothing. She aimed the light at the work table. The photograph was gone. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. She swept the phone's light across the table, the floor, anywhere the picture might have fallen. Nothing. The photograph had simply vanished. Then she heard it, a sound like fingernails on paper, scratching, coming from the box she'd found the photograph in, still sitting on the shelf behind her. Every instinct told Sarah to run. To leave the archives, the museum, maybe even Montgomery County entirely. But her hands moved almost independently, reaching for the box, pulling it down to the table. Inside, wrapped again in brown paper that she knew she'd thrown away days ago, was the photograph. Sarah's hands trembled as she unwrapped it. Part of her expected to find Emily standing alone in the frame, all the other children erased. Or perhaps the image would be blank entirely, everyone vanished into whatever impossible space existed inside antique photographs. But no, all 23 children remained. They stood in their original positions, as if nothing had changed. Emily in the back row, Margaret in the front, both looking at the camera with appropriate period expressions. Except for one detail that Sarah noticed immediately. Margaret Sullivan's bow was missing. It was a small thing, barely worth noting. But Sarah had studied this photograph for days now. She knew every detail. Margaret had worn a dark bow in her blonde hair. Now that bow was gone, and Sarah could swear she saw a strand of hair out of place, as if someone had grabbed it. Sarah's phone buzzed. An email from Rebecca in Sacramento. She opened it with shaking fingers. I found something else about my great-aunt Emily. My grandmother told me this story once when I was young. She said that Emily's body was found clutching something in her hand. The adults tried to pry her fingers open, but they wouldn't budge until after she'd been dead for several hours. When they finally got her hand open, they found a dark ribbon. No one knew where it came from. It wasn't Emily's. They buried it with her. Sarah looked at Margaret Sullivan's hair in the photograph, at the place where a ribbon should have been, but was no longer. She thought about Emily's mother, Grace, spending decades trying to prove her daughter had been murdered, never finding justice, dying with that wound still open and bleeding. She thought about Margaret Sullivan living a long, happy life, dying peacefully at 87, surrounded by family who celebrated her legacy. And she thought about the photograph that was supposed to have been destroyed but always came back. The scratching sound came again, this time from the photograph itself. Sarah didn't want to look. Everything in her screamed to close her eyes, to throw the photograph back in its box, to run. But she looked anyway. Emily had moved again. She no longer stood behind Margaret. She stood beside her, in the front row, where she'd never been in any previous version. Her hand rested on Margaret's shoulder. Her smile stretched from ear to ear. And Margaret's expression had changed. The unreadable look was gone, replaced by something that looked like fear. The other children in the photograph remained the same, frozen in 1911, unaware of the drama playing out beside them. But Emily and Margaret seemed almost alive, locked in their eternal confrontation. Sarah understood now why someone had written "Don't" on the back of the photograph, why it had been hidden away, why previous archivists had tried to destroy it. This wasn't just a photograph. It was a prison, or a hunting ground. Emily Thorne hadn't moved on after her death. She'd been trapped in the last moment she'd been truly happy. A school picture taken on a crisp October morning, 2 weeks before Margaret Sullivan pushed her down those stairs. And for more than a century, Emily had been waiting, moving through the image, position by position, getting closer to the girl who'd murdered her. Sarah grabbed the photograph. Her hands felt like ice, but she forced herself to turn it over. That single word, "Don't," stared back at her in faded pencil. But there was something else now. New writing, in a different hand, appearing as she watched. She's almost there. A child's handwriting. The letters shaky and uncertain, as if written by someone still learning cursive. Sarah flipped the photograph back over. Emily now stood directly in front of Margaret Sullivan, so close they were nearly touching. Her hands were raised, reaching for the other girl's throat. Her smile had transformed into something terrible, a rictus of rage and vindication frozen on a 9-year-old's face. And Margaret's eyes, which had been looking at the camera in every version Sarah had seen, now looked up at Emily with unmistakable terror. The lights flickered again. The temperature dropped another degree. Sarah heard a sound she couldn't identify at first, then recognized with growing horror. Footsteps. Small footsteps. A child's footsteps. Coming from the dark corners of the archive room where her phone's light couldn't reach. Sarah ran. She didn't grab her bag, didn't stop to lock the archive room, didn't even wait for the elevator. She took the stairs 2 at a time, burst through the museum's back door, and kept running until she reached her car 3 blocks away. Her hands shook so badly it took 4 tries to get the key in the ignition. She drove home in a daze, her mind refusing to process what she'd witnessed. It was impossible. All of it. Photographs didn't move. Ghosts weren't real. There had to be a rational explanation. But Sarah knew she'd never go back to that archive room. Whatever was happening with that photograph, whatever Emily Thorne was doing, it was beyond her understanding and far beyond her ability to stop. She called Margaret Winters the next morning and quit. No explanation, just a brief voicemail saying she couldn't continue the position. Margaret never called back. 3 weeks later, Sarah saw a news article online. The Montgomery County Historical Museum had experienced a minor fire in the basement archives. No one was hurt, but several boxes of documents had been destroyed. The museum director, Margaret Winters, announced her retirement shortly after, citing the stress of the incident. Sarah never asked which boxes had burned. She didn't want to know if the photograph had finally been destroyed, or if it had survived once again, waiting in the ashes for the next person curious enough to unwrap it. But here's the thing Sarah never learned, the detail that would have kept her awake every night for the rest of her life. That photograph wasn't the only one. In 1911, the photographer had taken 3 exposures, as was standard practice. 3 versions of the same class picture, taken seconds apart. One had been distributed to the school, where it hung in the hallway until the building was demolished in 1965. One had been given to the teacher, who'd kept it until her death in 1943. And one had been purchased by Margaret Sullivan's parents, who'd framed it and hung it in their daughter's bedroom. That's the version that ended up in the museum, donated by Margaret's grandson after her death. The one that Emily had been trapped in, moving slowly through the frame decade after decade, getting closer and closer to the girl who'd killed her. But the other 2 photographs? They were never found. And somewhere in Montgomery County, possibly in an attic or basement or forgotten storage unit, they're still out there, still changing, still waiting. And Emily is in those versions too, still moving, still hunting, still smiling that terrible smile. Because after more than a century, she's finally figured out something important. She's learned that being dead doesn't mean being powerless, and being trapped in a photograph doesn't mean you can't reach through and touch the living world. 3 students from Montgomery High School reported seeing a girl in old-fashioned clothing standing at the top of the main staircase last week. The school was built on the site of old Blackwood Elementary. The girl wore a white dress and dark braids. She was smiling. And when they asked if she needed help, she asked them a single question. "Have you seen Margaret?" They said no, of course not. Margaret Sullivan had been dead since 1989, but the girl just kept smiling. She's still looking. She's patient. She has all the time in the world. And somewhere in Montgomery County, there are 2 more photographs, waiting to be found by someone who doesn't know better. Someone who'll unwrap them and hold them up to the light and wonder about the girl in the white dress with the impossibly wide smile. Someone who'll look close enough to see.